Greetings, you intrepid Herle Burlyites. We've got a hell of a pod for you today because Elamin Abdelmahmoud is here. Elamin is big in the podcast and pop culture world with his own CBC show, Pop Chat. He's a culture writer at BuzzFeed News and is the founding co-host with Rosie Barton of the CBC Politics podcast, Party Lines, and he's also on the At Issue Panel on CBC The National on Thursday nights in a spot I never graduated to. And he has a new book out just for about a month now called Son of Elsewhere, a reflection on Blackness, faith, language, pop culture, and the challenges and rewards of finding your way in the world. We're going to talk today about that book, which was super interesting. We're going to talk about country music, which Elamin is oddly enough an expert in. And we're going to talk about politics, which perhaps even more oddly Elamin is an expert in. So we're going to get to all those things. But first of all, Elamin, I'm a big fan of yours, and I want to thank you. I've never had the opportunity to formally thank you. You gave this podcast a shout out on CBC a year or two ago as one of a podcast in Canada to listen to, and I really, really appreciated that. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here today.
Hey, my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm fine. I graduated to here. That's how I view this. This is my graduation.
Well, we'll see how the prom goes. Hey, have you seen any live music recently?
Have I seen live music recently? It's been a minute. It's been probably a few months or so. I'm trying to remember the last concert I went to. I'm one of those people who, for the longest time during the pandemic, was just avoiding concerts, avoiding gatherings, and then eventually my muscle for avoiding those things just completely atrophied. And I think it probably started when I went to Nashville for a story. And so I talked to Jason Isbell for that story. And as I was doing that, I realized that I miss live music more than anything. And then after that, I just kind of gradually kept going to shows here and there. It's been a good return.
I haven't seen anything literally for years. I mean, the only show I've seen, wow. I went to see Gordon Lightfoot at the opening of Massey Hall. Mm-hmm. And that was not a concert. It was an event, yes, but it wasn't a concert. Yes. And so I don't feel like I've seen live music since pre-COVID, really, and I'm dying.
What, do you know when your next concert's going to be?
I don't. I know the one I'm most excited about, and I'm most excited to see Golden Smog at the Horseshoe. And that's a band nobody's ever heard of, but it's made up of Jeff Tweedy from Wilco and Gary Lewis from the Jayhawks and a couple of members of the Replacements. And They get together every few years and they put out an album, and I didn't know that they ever toured. Anyway, I love them. I love both the Jayhawks and Wilco.
So when is this happening? Is that soon?
I believe it is in August.
Okay.
Tickets go on sale today. So I'll be working on that after I talk to you.
I was going to say, don't let me hold you up from that. My next concert is the Chicks, formerly known as the Dixie Chicks. They'll be playing in Toronto, I think, in a couple of weeks or so. And no, wait, I think it's literally next week. And I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be a good show.
You still like their music?
I do. I'm a fan of the last record. I think they're inventive, and you don't really anticipate the directions that they'll end up going in. But I'm here for them.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I don't know that I've heard a song since Earl.
Oh wow! You should get back on the wagon. You've missed a lot. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So listen, you've written an autobiography, and I read it, and it's great, and everybody should read it. Because it's really, really an interesting read. And frankly, I don't mean, this is not diminishing. It's not a hard read. It's an easy thing to read. There's no footnotes. And it's an autobiography that does not include the part of your life where you're famous.
You noticed that, eh?
It's a search for identity. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested, when I was reading it, what was the process for writing the book, Elamin? Is it something that you had been thinking about your whole life and then sat down at a keyboard and pounded out? Or did you say, I should write a book like this and sit down at the keyboard and start thinking about it?
Oh boy. First, let me start by saying that I had to get over this ego fight that I was having with myself, because for the longest time, I didn't want to write a book. I wanted to have written a book, and those are two different things. I wanted the self-satisfaction of having completed the process of writing a book. but I didn't know what the hell I wanted to write about. And I kept on circling different ideas and it just wasn't coming to me. And then I had to have this like big conversation with myself that's like, hey, fucking guy, pull it together. The idea of just wanting to write a book, you and a million other people have wanted that same thing. But what do you have to say? And as the more that I thought about that, the more that I wanted to return to this period of time when I first arrived in this country. I arrived in Canada when I was 12 years old. That was the year 2000. And I wanted to return to that period because I arrived from Sudan and I came to Kingston, Ontario. And Kingston, Ontario is a lovely town. Kingston, Ontario is also a predominantly white town, a town where someone who looks like me has to do quite a bit of finessing in order to figure their way through that town. And part of that finessing is putting away a few different identities, putting my Blackness on the shelf, putting my Muslimness on the shelf, putting the fact that I'm an immigrant also on the shelf. And I wanted to return to that. I wanted to return to what it is inside of me that wanted to go, these identities, I don't need this right now. I don't want to put this away. I don't want this around. And essentially apologize to all those versions or parts of myself that I just put on the shelf for so long. That's how this book was born.
But there are things you've been thinking about all your life because you've been feeling them all your life and you've been trying to sort this out.
Yeah, that's true. But I didn't know my entry point to them until I got back around to saying, you know, it's really quite something to make yourself small in these particular ways. It's really quite something to go through the process of erasing certain parts of your existence in order to fit in. So what does that do to a person? And how does that form you as a person? And the end result is, you know, this book.
You know, it's weird. I mean, on a tiny level, I know it's not remotely as profound, but I really identified with the book because I have a sense of myself that is rooted in my background in Saskatchewan, both in a small town, in a village, and then in Regina, in a very working class, lower middle class environment. Yeah. And I've found myself living in Ottawa and Toronto and hanging around with some of those powerful people in the world or some of the richest people in Canada. And I never feel like I belong. I always feel like an imposter. I don't belong at this cocktail party. I don't fit in. I don't belong hanging around with these people that went to Upper Canada College. I don't fit in. And yet when I go home to Regina, I know that that's not home anymore either. Yeah. Right? I don't know that place anymore. That place has moved on. It's grown. It's shaped. I've not been part of that. Right? Yeah. So I've always felt, to be honest, my whole adult life, rootless.
I was going to say, like, that's exactly the kind of sense that I was hoping someone would pick up from it, whatever their entry point is, because we tend to really, like, feel kind of suspended between a bunch of different identities, right? Like, there's no necessary thing that says, oh, I'm so firmly rooted in this part of my identity. We're always leaving one identity toward another, but never quite arriving at that other one. And because we're always kind of trying to arrive at another identity, but never quite making it, I think there's something interesting about that idea of suspension. That's the idea of Elsewhere that I was trying to get across. The idea of, you know what, stop trying to pretend that you are the Regina person or the cocktail party person, but live in the contradiction of being in the middle between the two of them. And what worlds open up when you say, you know what, the contradictions are the things that make me who I am. I'm so interested in what it looks like when you finally say, I live in the middle, and the middle is a sort of an odd place to be because some days I really gravitate towards this part, some other days I really gravitate towards that other part. Having said that, I don't know, maybe if you throw some cocktail parties, you'll start to belong a little bit more, you know?
I don't think those people would come to my cocktail party. That's part of how you know you don't belong. If you threw a party, would they come?
Well, that's a good point. That's a fair point. Yeah.
Your young life was fucking crazy. Okay.
A lot happened. Yeah.
The Americans, Bill Clinton, blew up a factory near your house with cruise missiles that you saw coming out of the sky with your own eyes. Yeah. Then your dad gets a Gestapo-like visit to the house from the authorities, and he has to flee the country. And you live without your dad for 5 years. And then you move to an entirely different part of the world by the time you're 12. You know, these are the ages when people get a bike and learn to swim.
That's true. That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's something about, you know what, I had a bike. And I remember thinking, what's going to happen to this bike as the sky was sort of lighting up with the fire of blowing up the factory. So the story about the factory is really interesting. Very few people seem to remember this episode of American history, mostly because it was happening during the Monica Lewinsky trial, during the Monica Lewinsky sort of hearings. But
it was a wag the dog.
Well, that's the accusation. I can't say that, but certainly that's...
you did say it. I read it in your book.
I certainly danced around it. You know, I'm not... I tried to say, I don't feel the need to be impartial about this. But certainly all the evidence points to the idea that, Bill Clinton bombed this factory mostly as a distraction from the very damning Monica Lewinsky trial. And there's something really, I will use the words of Christopher Hitchens instead of my own words, because he said the only possible explanation is that Clinton needed to do this to look presidential for a day. The factory he sort of accused the factory of making chemical weapons.
Happened to be the place that produced 50% of all the malaria drugs used in Sudan.
That's right. And very, very recently opened. And malaria is such a common problem in Sudan that suddenly when Sudan has a local source, right, of making the medication that we need and making the medication that the rest of Africa needed too, that's the place that gets blown apart. I mean, you cannot ask for a more explicit symbol of imperialism and colonialism than that specific moment, even if you were trying to. It just that sort of thing just kind of scripts itself. And the fact that they named the operation Infinite Reach is do these people have a sense of self-reflection whatsoever? No, they certainly do not. That at least didn't strike me as such.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I loved about the book, but it led me to kind of a profound question for myself, at least, which was you had trouble getting into hip hop and rap music when you first came to Canada. And part of it was your religious reaction to some of the lyrical content, but it also didn't make any sense to you.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm interested in what it was like to be black, but not North American black here, because you're going to have a lot of the same experiences, but you don't have any of the same cultural antecedents.
Yes, exactly. And so...
do you fit in with the black community?
I think so now, but it took a long time to get there. And I think when I say that to get there, I mean I'm never quite arriving, in the sense that I'm never quite I wake up and I'm very rooted in my black identity. For me, blackness is something that was kind of hard won. I had to very actively think about the ways that I wanted to be black and sort of assert a relationship to blackness here. Because when I first arrived in this country, I had grown up around a lot of other people who looked like me, but we never thought of ourselves as black. And this is further complicated by the fact that Sudan has this long history of shadism and colorism.
You have darker blacks in South Sudan who are discriminated against compared to you. Is that correct?
That's right. By me, by people who look like me, by my family members, by people that I knew. We sort of participated in that willingly. And so in our minds, it was no, we're not black. That's black. That's a whole other thing. And so then to come here and be confronted with, hey, you're black, and also this has some kind of cultural context and some kind of cultural history that you got to get to know. Frankly, it was first overwhelming. But then in a place like Kingston, it's more complicated by the fact that the only thing that I had was television. Television was my only source of blackness. So I'd turn on the TV, and then I'd see Ja Rule, and I'd be like, we're no way we're the same thing. We do different things with our lives. And so at first I ran away from blackness. The writer Zadie Smith has this thing where she describes blackness as a cultural residue. And I think that's right. That's sort of that feels like the correct kind of analogy to me. Because sometimes you have a bit more of that residue, more access to that residue than other times. It's a bit nebulous. It's sometimes I feel very close to my blackness, and sometimes I'm not really sure what it even means. And it took a long time just to get to this negotiation of some days I feel very rooted in that blackness, and some days I feel very foreign to it.
Right. And
Yeah.
you, how do you get closer to it? Like what is the way, what are the things you do to feel part of that community, and why do you want to feel part of that? Like, I mean, you're not embracing your elsewhereness there. You're wanting to be somewhere there.
Yeah. Well, I just mean sometimes I am there in the sense that like I've been drafted to that team, and I sometimes feel sort of a closer part of it. I think there's a really rich history that connects with people who look like me and sound like me and tell stories the same way that my grandparents used to tell stories. And part of that, there is some relationship, like the storytelling, the long sort of history of that, to me is like, it draws me closer to an idea of Blackness. And then I think there are other days where I feel closer to my Sudanese identity, and that's complicated in its own relationship to Blackness because Sudan is absolutely a Black country that has for a long time denied itself that part of its own identity in order to identify closer to, Arabs. To this day, if you look at, a map of the Middle East, Sudan is a little dip of the Middle East because the Middle East is mostly Asia, and then there's, the 5 African countries, and you get Morocco, and you get Libya, you get Algeria, you get Egypt, and then there's this little dip in Sudan, and Sudan is sort of like the southernmost part, if you will, of the Middle Eastern identity, and so much of Sudanese identity is rooted in that Arabness because we speak Arabic, because we consume so much sort of Arabic culture or Arab culture, that I'm not sure that we identify with our Blackness that often, but then when we do, it kind of comes out in these like specific songs about specific locations, and I think that's like a similar way that I relate to my own Blackness.
Yeah. About a year and a half ago, I did a research exercise where I wanted to do some focus groups about race in Canada. Mm-hmm. And I put together a group of Caucasians to talk to, and I put together a group of Indigenous people to talk to, and I put together a group of Black people to talk to, and I put together a group of other people of color, racialized people. So I had 4 different conversations. When I asked people to tell me what Canadian values were, the white group had no trouble identifying things like compassion and tolerance and diversity and all these things. The people of color and Indigenous groups actually couldn't identify what they thought Canadian values were. And in fact, the Black group was explicit with me that there was no such thing as Canadian values, that there were different values across the country, and that if you were a Black person, you better find your way to Toronto, because the only place in the country where you're going to have a reasonable life experience is in Toronto. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't think so. That doesn't compute with at least my experience of being Black in this country and living in a place that isn't Toronto for at least half of my time in this country. It's really interesting that you had groups that couldn't identify what Canadian values are. And I think like the idea of this Black experience, at least in this focus group, of feeling like Blackness is only safe in Toronto. I think that is a common story that is told in this country, but I don't think it's true. There's, of course, Black people everywhere. There's a long history of Black people for example, in Atlantic Canada.
But I had a guy from Dartmouth who tells me that when he gets ready to go out for the night, he has to anticipate that he might get pulled over.
Right. But are we talking about, so is this about treatment, right? Is this sort of like their reflection is about treatment specifically? Yeah. I guess it's about, for me, the ways that you have to adjust to your own locale. And I think Toronto asks a little bit less adjustment from you than other places. The Black people I know who live in places like Kingston or live in places like Calgary or live in places like Vancouver, they're very familiar with the code switching that you have to do in those places in order to feel like you belong, in order to communicate overly that you're not a threat. I don't know what that code switching does to you in terms of your quality of life. You know what I mean? I don't know if that diminishes it greatly. For some folks it does. For some folks it does not. I don't know what it does to you to constantly not be surrounded by people who look like you and be sort of constantly explaining yourself. So I would imagine that would take away a lot from you. And then there's a sort of the overt and less overt racism that you see. Everyone is familiar with like the look that you get. You know, if you're a black person and you're driving through, I don't know, Bob Cage in Ontario, like you're going to get a look when you walk into the store. Sometimes it's malicious and sometimes it's not, and you learn very quickly to tell the difference. And maybe Toronto is the only place where you can be a person, which is to say, to have your blackness not be a part of your identity that you're carrying into every store or every place that you walk into. I think that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Herle Burlyites, welcome to Spectrum Squatting 101, or the hoarding of and then not using wireless spectrum waves by some of our country's biggest regional carriers. I told you last week we were going to do a wee seminar on this. Instead of deploying, they just sit on it, leaving entire swaths of rural Canadians not connected to our high-speed digital world. Why? Because these regional billion-dollar companies would rather wait it out, hoping to resell it later for massive profit. It's called spectrum speculation. On behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, we've talked about all of this here before. What we haven't talked about is how government digital policy that allows for spectrum squatting is harming the fight against climate change and potentially keeping us from reaching our targets. Best practice digital policy is climate policy. That's the finding of the Farpoint report, an independent technology consultancy out of the UK. With more widespread digital adoption, that's high-speed connectivity across all of rural and urban Canada, we could all work more effectively from home. There'd be fewer cars and trucks on the road, shorter, more efficient routes for trains, planes, and cargo ships, and a reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions of between 120 to 190 megatons, 40 to 60% of our Paris targets. But every link in the chain has to be connected to achieve any of it. Spectrum squatting just breaks that chain. There is a remedy. TELUS believes that all this hoarded spectrum must be brought back to market so it can be used to deliver service. That for all Canadians to be connected faster, the government must apply a use it or lose it policy, ubiquitously to all carriers, national and regional, urban and rural. And an ongoing climate crisis combined with a new and critical spectrum auction that's about to happen means there's no time like the present. Hey, let's talk about faith for a second.
Let's do it.
You grew up in an environment, so I grew up in a very, very Catholic environment. The entire village I lived in was Catholic, like 100% Catholic and devout church-going people. My mother was very devout. I have a sister who was a nun. I have zero faith? Affinity. Yeah, zero faith. Wow. Zero affinity with Catholicism, Christianity. I don't believe. Even though I went to Catholic schools, the whole shooting match. Now, you grew up in an environment where faith was central to your existence. It was the center of the community. It was the center of your family life. Everything, according to what I got from the book, was everything revolved in your hometown and around Khartoum of faith and the Muslim faith. And, you came to Canada. Very quickly, being a Muslim became a hostile, scary thing to be, because 9/11 happened.
Sure.
And doesn't sound necessarily like you've gone as far as I have, but you sound like faith is a much, much, much diminished part of your life. What's that journey been about, and how much has being in Canada, where belief in religion is on the rapid, rapid decline, how much have been the impact of that?
Well, I'm afraid that the thing that my parents were worried about has exactly happened, right? Like that's the thing is I've sort of delivered to them exactly the thing that they have worried about for such a long time, which is like, hey, we're going to take him to Canada and then he's going to lose his whole faith. And I think that has begun to happen in a certain way. I have days where I feel very Muslim, but not in the practice sense. It's been a long time since I've gotten all 5 prayers in, but on Eid day, on days when I gotta call my parents or go with my parents to the mosque, I'm a little bit closer to it. But it's complicated for me because I grew up with this understanding that faith is either a full totalizing thing, the thing that you're in all the time, or if you're not doing that, then you've completely lost your faith. And so, as a result, I feel like I don't have any, even though I don't think that's true. I feel like I sort of, I have this complicated relationship to whether I think the ways of living are correct or not. I have this complicated relationship to how often I practice my faith.
Do you believe the central story?
I don't know.
Because I don't. That's my problem. Once you don't believe the central story, then where do you go with it?
Well, here's the thing is like, okay, so one of the longest essays that I was going to write for this book was going to be about God and Tom Waits, because I'm a big Tom Waits guy. And Tom Waits has really like restructured my relationship with God, I feel, like just in terms of like the ways that he's found to question. It's like, okay, let's grant that God exists. Let's ask him a bunch of questions in song form. And those to me have been deeply formative in me asking those questions. But I'm not sure that I've settled on a place. I'm not sure I've settled on a place of, hey, this story is not for me, or this story is absolutely correct and I'm just not doing a very good job practicing. I've also, you may have noticed, have been ducking this question for like 5 minutes or so. And it's because I don't know. I sort of continuously am on this place where I just simply don't know. And every day that something good happens in my life, I kind of like look up at the sky and be like, hey man, like, thank you. I appreciate that. Because I should probably remember to do this during these moments. But then when the bad things happen, I'm sort of like, well, I don't know. Let's just be chill. Like there's no higher power to sort of blame this on. And so, but also I'm not sure that I'm very different than most people. I think most people go through these negotiations all the time, especially when you've grown up so deeply steeped in faith. It's hard to just pick up your bags and just head out the door. Like, how did you do it?
I just picked up my bags and headed out the door. Like I spent a long time where I described myself as a C, E, and M Catholic. Christmas, Easter, and when my mother was in town.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm gonna come up with the Muslim version of that.
and then she died, and I dropped those things as well. Yeah. So I mean, I just don't believe in it, and I can't fake that I believe in it. I think a lot of people don't come to that firm conclusion, and so they just don't follow what they're thinking to their logical conclusion. But it's more like hope than faith. John Turner once told me there's no atheists in a foxhole. So I think that's kind of where most people are at.
Yeah.
Okay.
I buy that.
So what's your conclusion about elsewhere? Is it better to be somewhere, or is elsewhere a good place to be?
I think it's certainly harder to be elsewhere. It's much easier to be in a specific place. It's much easier to wake up and say, I'm firmly rooted in this identity. If somebody asks me what, about myself, this word will be a word that I use to describe myself. That's much easier. That takes so much of the guesswork out of the whole deal, right? I think it's more rewarding to be in this elsewhere because you get to navigate the complexities. You get to sort of have all the different shades of nuance around it and say, I don't know, it's complicated. Ask me tomorrow.
It's obviously part of what's made you as interesting to millions of Canadians as you are.
I mean, hopefully the negotiation is a part of the story. Also, first of all, thank you for saying millions of Canadians. It's very nice of you.
Well, I'm not current with the viewership of the National, so don't hold me to it. But I...
Nor am I. They don't give me the numbers. So, yeah.
Hey, can we talk about country music? I'm not forgetting about the book. Buy this book. Yeah. It's a great read. And if you want to understand, hey, for all you white people, you want to understand something about the immigrant experience, right? Pick up this book.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm going to get a gif of you saying, hey, you white people. I'm going to keep that for a long time. Thank you.
Speaking of white people, country music.
Good segue. Okay. Good.
I once had the opportunity at the Grammy Awards to sit beside Isaac Hayes.
Okay, wow. You can no longer claim to be of the Regina people, by the way, if you just use that sentence out there. That's a heavy sentence. That's incredible. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And he was in the white robe and the whole thing. It was like Black Moses, Jesus. Yeah. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of hat acts in the show. And I was super interested to watch him during the hat acts, and he enjoyed them. And he would give them a standing ovation at the end. And I was like, Jesus, man, right? This is bullshit. And
You don't have to do this. Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
But you like country music, and you
I
must
do.
have a tortured relationship with country music because it's no home for. I mean, it's people like Jason Isbell are fighting hard to create opportunities, and there's women like Yolo who are pretty interesting. But it's not. It's more of a Morgan Wallen genre than it is a Yolo genre for sure.
Yeah, I think there's something about country music that is home to me, regardless of the people who try to not make it home to me. I'm a latecomer to country music. I didn't discover country music until probably 6 or 7 years ago or so, when a former boss of mine used to work at TVO. The agenda was Steve Paikin, and our former executive producer there said, "Hey, you're listening to the band. Have you ever tried to listen to the Byrds?" And I was like, "No, I've never heard anything from the Byrds." And I started with Sweetheart of the Rodeo. That was my first record.
So Graham Parsons is a good introduction to country music.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And I immediately sort of fell in love with it. And the thing that I fell in love with was the ways that it reminded me of Sudanese music. It's like this is music that is evocative of place and evocative of geography and evocative of history in a similar way to what Sudanese music does for me. And then I started digging into this, and next came Emmylou Harris, and then I was done. I was like, oh yeah, I'm clearly into this genre. I will follow it wherever it goes. But I think what was interesting.
It's not really fair. It's not really fair because I'd follow Emmylou Harris anywhere, no matter whether she was singing or not. I mean, I would just follow Emmylou Harris around. Yeah.
Hey, she's coming in August, just so you know. You should be there. As I sort of was falling in love with country music, as you sort of dig into the history, it kind of becomes apparent that this is essentially black music. Like its history is a black genre. Certainly,
Didn't Willie Nelson call it blues?
He certainly did, but because it kind of is, right? Like it's like a formulation it's a rebranding of the blues, and there's a lot of history that goes back to the turn of the 20th century, when basically black and white string bands were playing the exact same music, but due to the genius of a couple of people, Ralph Peer being chief among them, they designed a system essentially that said, if it's black people doing the same kind of music, then it's going to be called race music. And if it's white people, then they called it something else. Like first, it was hillbilly music, and then it became country music. And there is no good reason to think that country music, at its source and its core, is that different from blues than R&B. Like it comes from the same well. Of course, culturally, you could say we've gone in certain directions that are not hospitable to that old sort of source point, and I think that's true. But I think you gotta not let the Morgan Wallens corrupt where this music comes from. I think that's really deeply important here.
Well, okay. So, do you like all country music or certain types of country music? Like I'm familiar with, you went down and you covered that stand that Jason Isbell had at the Ryman, where he had a different opening act every night at the Ryman. And I know that you've written about Brandi Carlile, so you're into this kind of alt country Americana that I'm into. Are you also into mainstream country and western? Because that isn't really mainstream country music. Like when I run to people in Mississauga who tell me they like country music, and I say I like country music too. Do you like Jason Isbell? They've never heard of Jason Isbell. They want to talk to me about Eric Church, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I like all of it, man. I don't. There's very little discrimination in my body. Like there was for a period of time, probably from like 2012 until maybe 2018 or so, the main country pop sort of formulation and formula was like this genre that people called bro country. That's like the people like Florida Georgia Line. And I was like, this is objectively terrible music. Yeah. But also, when the summer rolls around and you just want like music to drive down the highway to, it's pretty good. It kind of gets the job done. And so, regrettably, I'm like, oh no, this is terrible music, but I can like enjoy it as it's happening. So I would say like I dip my toes into all of the different country music waters. Whether it's, Eric Church is great. I'm a big Eric Church guy. I think he's got sort of like structurally sound, really good songwriting. But there's much worse examples, and unfortunately, I'm into them as well.
I have always skipped the Nashville establishment country. I fell into in high school the Austin country music scene. Right?
Yeah.
I've got behind me. If you haven't heard this record,
I've not.
You got to hear this record. Jerry Jeff Walker.
I wrote it down.
Jerry Jeff Walker, A Man Must Carry On. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of my favorite albums in my collection, for sure.
Okay.
So, but he was part of that whole Willie and Waylon genre, right? And so that scene I loved and still love all that music. And then in my latter years, I've gravitated toward this Americana genre, but I've never been part of the Nashville thing because it's always seemed plastic and inauthentic.
Yeah.
Professional but not meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, it is so incredibly conservative and right-wing politically and racially overtoned. I mean, whether it's the Dixie Chicks losing their status in the world or Morgan Wallen gaining his, there's a lot about that genre that in the business of it that's objectionable.
You're totally correct about all of that. Like there's nothing wrong about that there's nothing incorrect about that characterization. It is morally questionable. The fact that it is successful is merely due to this effect where this Jason Isbell described it as like the country establishment figured out that if they hit a button, $20 comes out. Like there's no good reason to sort of keep inventing the form beyond that. It's like, well, if we hit on these themes in a song, then people will pay it. People will play the song on the radio and they will listen to it. And it's just like names keep replacing names, but the themes stay exactly the same. I think the energy that they're trying to create is correct is a good fit for certain kind of gatherings, if you will. You can imagine that this stuff would be very popular, Stampede, for example, because it gets like crowds going in a certain way. I'm not someone who's, gonna suggest that this should make anybody's top 10 list any year because it's like, from someone who reviews music for a living, I can look at this and go like, oh no, this is a terrible song. But also, it's fun and it sort of bypasses the brain to get, into like some kind of like euphoria area of your brain that has nothing to do with evaluating good music. There's this guy, his name is Walker Hayes, and he had this song last year called Fancy Like, and it is probably the worst song in recorded truly the worst song in recorded history. It's a song about going on a date to Applebee's. Like, it is so awful, genuinely awful. It'll never make, it's no LA Freeway, I'll tell you that. Like, it's no sort of competition with, hey, here's a song trying to say something. But I am always curious about stuff that gets so popular despite being so awful, because there's something about it that's like, it's bypassing your judgment, if you will. Like, it's bypassing the brain's part of the judgment. This is Daniel Kahneman shit, This is thinking fast and slow. This is like, here's a song that's going to make you not think, and the only reason it's going to appeal to you is because you're not turning on your brain right now. I'm interested in songs that do that because I think that's a science. It's a dark art, It's a dangerous art, but it's interesting to me. And so I listen to it, just got to keep an eye on it to be like, what are these wizards inventing these days, and how are they going to try to harm us as a society? But I would never recommend it to a person. So I'm so sorry if you end up looking up Fancy Like by Walker Hayes. Please don't. It's the worst song ever recorded.
Yeah, it's on my list of things to avoid in life now.
Good.
Hey, I know you ran a radio station, but
yes.
But how old are you?
I'm 34 years old.
34?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, fuck off. I'm turning 60 tomorrow.
Hey, happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so you're 34 years old.
Yes.
I know you ran a radio station.
Well, this was a high school radio station.
Fair enough, whatever.
Sure.
But you have an encyclopedic knowledge of music and presumably pop culture way, way, way before your time. You and I had a private Twitter direct message exchange about a Brandi Carlile album, and you told me that Paul Buckmaster had done the strings on the album. Now, Paul Buckmaster, for those of you who don't know, which is every fucking buddy listening, okay? Paul Buckmaster was the string arranger on the first 4 Elton John albums that came out in 1970 and 1971. Elton John, The Friends soundtrack, Tumbleweed Connection, and Madman Across the Water. And he got quite a bit of acclaim for the work that he did on those albums. But that is a name that nobody knows. How do you know that name?
Well, part of it is because I am interested in not just the music, but the way that the music gets made. Like for me, part of the curiosity of doing pop culture for a living is being curious about how artists become the artists that they are. And so much of that is baked into my relationship with like an artist like Brandi Carlile. I know so much about her work because I'm so invested in the way that her work gets sort of transmitted to someone like me. Sorry, did I cut out? I think I cut out there for a minute, but
yeah, I gotcha. Yeah.
Okay. And Paul Buckmaster comes up in Brandi Carlile's memoir. She wrote a memoir last year, and she talked about the episode about how she got Paul Buckmaster to do the arrangements on a couple of the songs. And I was like, oh, I'm not familiar with his work because this is not a name I'm familiar with. And then I sort of go deeply into it. And I'm like, oh, he's responsible for all the good string arrangements from all those, incredible Elton John records. And then that piece of information kind of gets lodged in the brain and mercifully doesn't get lost. But like to me, pop culture has been a way of decoding the world around me. So I'm very hungry for not just what's the thing that's popular, but how did it get this way, And so I kind of take it almost too seriously, I would say.
Right. What's your favorite genre of music to listen to?
Oh boy. Probably country music to be honest with you. Like Americana, I would say, is like the stuff that I tend to gravitate the most towards.
Right.
Yeah. Wait, what's your favorite Elton John record? Have we talked about this?
Well, I could pick a different one on any given day.
Sure.
If I'm ever recommending one, I recommend Goodbye Yellow Brick Road to people if they're unfamiliar with his work, because I think it's the commercial apex. It's probably the creative apex, and it has more good songs on it than almost any record ever made. So it's good. It's a good listen. But it's not where I go. If I'm going back to the 70s, and I don't always, by the way, I'm a person that likes the 80s and 90s and 2000s work as well. But if I'm going back to the 70s, I will probably listen to Tumbleweed Connection, Captain Fantastic, or Blue Moves.
Do you ever find it fascinating and return to like this period of time where somehow the people making the most compelling country songs were British artists? Like the Tumbleweed period, but also like for a period of time, the Rolling Stones were like among the best country music makers out there.
Oh, they do great country. They do great country, especially when they were working with Graham Parsons. They did great country.
Correct.
Right?
I think there's an argument to be made that if you pluck certain songs out of the Rolling Stones discography, you could assemble one of the best country albums ever recorded. Because they went through a pretty long period of time where every album had 2 or 3. That's just a country song. You're listening to a country music song that's coming from the Rolling Stones, and they were. Well,
there aren't many country albums. There aren't many country albums on which Wild Horses wouldn't be the best track on the album.
Exactly. Right? Exactly right. Yeah.
This guitar behind me is the guitar on which Bernie Taupin wrote Elton John's lyrics.
Oh boy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty invested. Down that road. But Tumbleweed. The reason I raised that is because the cool story about Tumbleweed Connection, which you mentioned as a country album. Mm-hmm. Bernie Taupin and Elton John had never left England when they made that album.
Yeah.
And Bernie Taupin based it mostly on Marty Robbins songs and band lyrics. So Robbie Robertson and Marty Robbins were the inspiration for the Tumbleweed Connection album.
That's what you would get pretty good country music out of those two things. I think that's a really good marriage. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Also, man, with the Isaac Hayes story with this guitar, you're getting further and further from the Regina out here. Like it's really suspended that elsewhere.
Yeah, Elton was never a big fit in Regina, right?
Yes, I can imagine.
Yeah, so sort of I was always an oddity in that regard. You've all heard me speak here before about how deceptively dangerous railroad tracks can be for anyone but railroaders. They are purpose-built for rolling colossuses weighing thousands of tons, and they are perilous for anything and anybody else. And yet, some people seem drawn to train tracks. It's something our sponsor, CN, spends a great deal of time and effort trying to discourage. Like other big railways, CN has its own dedicated force of police officers, and keeping the tracks clear and safe is part of their job. Reinhold Weisbach is a CN officer stationed in Chilliwack, BC, on the busiest stretch of track in Canada. He patrols, and sometimes he issues tickets, but that isn't always useful. There are homeless people living in the bush near the CN tracks. Some have mental health issues. Others have problems with alcohol. They tend to ignore tickets or run away at the sight of a railway policeman. So nowadays, Constable Weisbach patrols with a mental health nurse. He works with homeless shelters and First Nations elders. He brings along donuts from Timmy's. The nurse offers counseling and help finding shelter, and he explains that the engineer of a train traveling at speed can't just slam on the brakes or steer out of the way. Sometimes, says Constable Weisbach, people tell him they'll just get out of the way when they hear the train. And he tells them that by the time you hear a train, it can be too late. Anyway, CN officers and safety officials are out there every day across the railway's network, training first responders and patrolling and reaching out, the way Constable Weisbach does. And encouragingly, accidents are declining. But they shouldn't happen at all. Nobody beats a train. Please don't try. Hey, let's talk politics. Let's talk politics.
Let's do it.
You do a lot of political commentary. You're on, as I said, the At Issue Panel. You co-host a politics podcast with Rosie Barton. What the hell do you know about politics?
Fucking nothing. I don't know why they keep telling me to do this stuff, but here we are. Right. So I should say I don't host the politics podcast anymore. It's kind of come to an end.
Okay. I didn't realize. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's been put on hiatus. No worries. But I'm someone for whom politics has always been very serious. And by that I mean like when I arrived in this country, my dad made a point of talking to me at length about how helpful the Liberals, very specifically Peter Milliken, were in terms of being the reason why we are in this country. This was an explicit part of the conversation. This was something that for him meant a lot, just in terms of like repeating this story all the time. He repeated it every election. And I was like, Dad, there's other political parties. And he'd be like, no, there aren't. And so I think like my interest in politics probably started when I arrived in this country. I was like, okay, let me figure out what this nation is about. And one of the things that I turned to is just watching the political coverage because it was so different from what I was used to in Sudan, aka there not being any oppositions or any kind of thing. And so that's where I would say it started, and then from there on, spending a lot of time talking with people about politics has kind of like led us here. But listen, I'm surprised. I'm just as surprised as you are. So
what perspective do you talk about it from? I'm interested. Like I'm a practitioner. So when I do the Curse of Politics, I talk about politics from the aspect of a practitioner. Sometimes people are journalists, and I don't really think you're a journalist as I'm describing it. You're not Susan Delacourt. So you're not coming at it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So what is the perspective you bring to it?
I think it's a cultural commentator, a sort of a broader cultural curiosity. So I'm less interested in the day-to-day occurrences of politics than I am in the general direction of where we're headed. And for me, like that is my general training. That is where I spent the most of my time sort of thinking about. And so for me, that's where the good stuff is. It's like when you guys have a conversation about what kind of party does a conservative party want to be in the future, which is essentially a question about where is conservatism headed in the future? That's a conversation that I am more interested in than, hey, what does the ground game have to look like in order for this party to sort of win its day? Like, that's stuff that I deeply respect. I'm very grateful for the expertise of people like you, because then I don't have to pretend to know anything.
Yeah. So that's funny. What is your take on what's going on in America? First of all, actually, let me take a step back. I did want to ask you something because, I just want to ask you something because it was on my mind when you mentioned the culture standpoint. Being a culture commentator doesn't always merge with political commentary as much as you think it might. I'll be honest with you. I had Chuck Klosterman on this show.
Sure.
And I read everything Chuck writes, and I love Chuck, and, but I started talking to him about politics, and he didn't have anything to say. I was very disappointed. Like, I mean, somebody that thinks about culture in the way that he does really he didn't translate that to politics. He didn't have anything he wanted to say, but you merged those two things, and I think that's interesting.
I mean, I think that partly has to do with like the stuff that I was reading when I was sort of coming to grips with this stuff. So for me, like, I was reading a lot of like the political sociologists, the Anthony Giddenses of the world, like the sort of trying to begin to understand that politics and culture are deeply related, and like where we are culturally ends up reflecting on where we are politically. I mean, there's a million ways to understand, for example, Trudeau's win in 2015. But I think if you're missing the cultural lens on that, then you're missing most of the ballgame. Just in terms of like a rise of a certain kind of politic and a certain kind of way of speaking. And so I think like part of being a culture writer is being attuned to the shifting ways that people are speaking about a certain thing. And some of that is like literal linguistics. I mean, I graduated from Queen's University in 2011 as a gender studies graduate. And back at the time, man, like the idea of, say, for example, privilege is like, it was like a strictly academic application of this concept. It was like, here's like a really useful concept to understand how a system might end up being blind to certain ways of living and privilege other ways of existence. And now, like, it's like a regular sort of political utterance. Like, there's a sort of deeply woven into the political rhetoric, the way that people are talking like this. That's a huge culture shift that I don't think we've fully understood or grappled with. And I think we underestimate it, or some parties.
Very divisive concept, by the way.
Of course. But its rise is important. Like, it's significant in sort of understanding that there is a part of the electorate and there's a part of the national conversation that's always going to have to pay some kind of attention to talking in this way. So that's for me, like, that's where I draw a lot of my interest from, is like these larger cultural contexts for the way that we ended up talking about politics now.
All right. So then now let's go to my big question. We can talk about Canadian politics all we want, but the big fucking show is happening south of us. The world seems on the line below the 49th parallel. I feel like over the next 3 years, some really, really important things about the future of the world are going to get decided.
Yeah.
In the midterms and in the presidential elections in the United States. And boy, I'm afraid of it. What is your reaction to what you're watching down there?
Well, I think I'm watching with curiosity the conflicting stories about whether Joe Biden is supposed to be the person who carries this flag into that next presidential election.
Let me just stop that right now. I watched him on Jimmy Kimmel the other night. Don't know if you saw this or not.
I did not.
Okay. Well, it's the friendliest environment he could possibly be in. Right?
Yeah.
He scared the shit out of me. He couldn't complete a thought. He couldn't complete a sentence. He cannot sustain his train of thought to its conclusion. He can't be the candidate. No, this is worse. He can't be the candidate, right? He's an old 80-year-old, not a young 80. He's an old 80 now.
But so this is what I mean, is that like this is a part of the larger conversation that probably started, in 2019 when there was talk of, okay, if Joe Biden is for sure going to run and going to become the next candidate for the Democrats, then can he commit to being a one-term president? And in doing so, be the person who passes the torch from one version of being a liberal in America to the next version of being a liberal. And we don't know what that next version is because it has many champions. It has many different prongs. And the one thing that unites all those prongs is that liberals think that they can't lose in the US, and they continuously do so. And so I think like that is a central question. It's always been the case that the progressive movement has been growing in the US, but all the while losing political power. But we've kind of come to, as you're describing it, like this deeply crucial moment of a very well-organized Republican Party that is very good at getting and retaining power. And the consequences of it are global. They're serious for all of us. But it's a bigger question for me right now. What is the next version of the Democratic Party and who are its champions? Because that's the question that people should be asking as they watch this whole circus unfold. And if Joe Biden intends to run in the next election, what kind of trouble are people in? I think that's a serious question that a lot of folks have been asking so far.
It's become clear that there's a lot of people who would prefer a non-democratic outcome that they like to a democratic outcome that they don't like. Are you coming from elsewhere? Are you surprised or not surprised by how shallow the roots of democracy are?
I think I'm not at all surprised because all it took was a figure to say, you know what, those people don't like you. And we can just take power, and this figure being mostly Trump. And if we can take and keep power by any means necessary, well, we can keep the people that we don't like out of this. I don't know why we ever thought that tree of democracy is as sturdy as we thought it was, because it's built on a lot of conventions. It's built on a lot of, we just believe that the person who loses will say, sorry, my bad. I lost this election. Congratulations. I'm out of here. And of course, we've done a lot of work to value and cherish that tradition and that convention. But as it turns out, it's pretty
Most
fragile.
important president in U.S. history is George Washington because he left.
Because he left, yes.
Because he left.
He left willingly, and he said, okay, we're going to pass this on so somebody else could be the president. And he understood very early on that this wasn't meant to be sort of a monarch recreation, right? But the problem is when you have a figure like Trump, who's much more interested in just keeping power, and no one really remembers specifically what Trump did in office so much as he just provoked and antagonized for 4 years. I mean, he was running against Hillary 4 years later, right? Because she was sort of the most identifiable left figure that he could still sort of, brandish and use as a weapon. I think that's an interesting set of politics that was entirely predictable and foreseeable in terms of seeing. When you ask the folks at CNN whether they regret letting Trump speak for 4 hours at a time on a television rally during prime time, I think they might say, yeah, we definitely regret that, because all it did is sort of see this idea that
they
that's all
cashed
you
the
gotta
fucking
do.
checks from advertisers.
They sure did. They sure did. But now what do we do? Now we're in this place, so what do we do with this?
Right.
Yeah.
So, bringing it north to Canada, I mean, on the curse of politics, there's Jenny Byrne, who's running Poilievre's campaign.
Yes.
There's Scott Reed, who thinks that Poilievre is summoning the forces of Satan. And there's me, who doesn't like or agree with Poilievre, but is unclear about how dangerous a person and how unorthodox a person he really is.
Sure.
Where are you at on all that?
Well, let me ask you, do you need Poilievre to moderate, to become more moderate if he becomes leader? Is that something that you're banking on, or is that something that you're not banking on?
I'm banking on the fact that the rhetoric is extreme right now, but the substance isn't terribly extreme. Like, I'm not hearing proposals that sound like he's going to change the policy direction of the country fundamentally. I mean, maybe on climate he would. But I think any conservative who wins will do that.
The vaccine thing felt like a significant moment in the sense that he was talking about basically not having any further vaccine mandates. He meant about COVID-19.
They say it was about COVID-19, but it felt like it was maybe deliberately a little ambiguous on that allowed people to interpret it how they wanted to interpret it.
But this is what I mean, right? Is that like he's willing at least to entertain being a figure who's seen as someone who's like basically willing to go back on most vaccines, even if that's not actually the case. Like that's not the actual case, the text. I'm curious constantly about who he's speaking to because you had Corey Tenag on your show. He talked about the fact that Doug Ford can win a province like this one by mostly not aggravating any of those people and any of those tensions. It makes me think, well, why would Pierre Poilievre think that he can aggravate those tensions and win in this province, in Ontario? I'm not sure that he can. I'm not sure that there's enough votes there for him speaking that way. And the more that he keeps speaking that way, the longer the trail is going to be for his opponents to paint him otherwise.
What do you mean by that, speaking that way? Because, there's a lot of people in the elites that get worked up about things. But do you think the average voter thinks it is a negative for him that he proposes to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada? Is that something an ordinary voter thinks, that's fucking outrageous? The Bank of Canada is an independent institution from the government of Canada and should be left aside from politics. It's outrageous that this person has a point of view about the performance of the Bank of Canada. I don't think that's what you'd find in Peel on the door.
I appreciate that you did the ordinary Canadian voice while shouting these words as though this is like a deeply divisive issue. No, but I do think that we are fundamentally a pretty institutionalist country, or at least we have a history of being so. And by that I mean, I think there's a deep respect for institutions and a deep respect for the ways that we do things. And someone threatening that, I think that's the larger threat that Pierre Poilievre poses. Now, some people are attracted to that because they see those institutions as not working and particularly corrupt. And so he will appeal to those people. But I think by and large, I think people will begin to see him as a reckless figure or could see him as a reckless figure. And that could be the biggest threat to him. It's how do I say this? It's like the absence of moderation in terms of the way that he's positioning these issues right now. Maybe that will change. Maybe the Pierre Poilievre who gets introduced to people later will talk less about the Bitcoin stuff, and less about the vaccine stuff and more about the future economic prospects of this country, which are a serious problem that we need to address and we need to talk about. And it's very confounding that the government currently is not talking about economic growth because that's the thing they keep getting hammered on all the time. And he can be a very effective mouthpiece for that. But it's a matter of how big is the archive of clips about maybe unsavory things that he keeps saying that people can kind of throw in his face when he's talking about economic prospects in this country later, when presumably he becomes leader.
Well, it will be absolute political malpractice if the next Liberal campaign does not have an ad featuring him hauling on a hookah with some bros talking crypto.
I mean, that's yes, that one produces itself. Yes, one can imagine that. But also, the risk to that to the Liberals is pretty significant in the sense that they don't want to seem so out of touch, because when somebody positions themselves as this ultimate populist, when you're running against the thing that's populist, you got to be very careful in terms of like not striking the notes of, I go to too many cocktail parties and I own the guitar that Bernie Taupin wrote most of his Elton John songs on, because that's dangerous territory.
Yeah. I have part of my problem with getting worked up about Poilievre is
what's that?
That when I see the kind of anger that exists out there, and disenfranchisement and desire for change, and I see it in the states that elect Trump. I see a situation where people in the states said, "I'm willing to take change that I don't even know what it would be, over what would be the most competent administrator of the status quo in Hillary Clinton." Yeah. And I see all that, and I could, if I wanted to, say conservatives are stirring up shit, and conservatives are telling lies, and conservatives are making people angry. But what I really say is liberalism's failed. Where did we go wrong? Why are those people, we've been in power for a long time, why are those people like that? Why are they so angry? That's what it makes me reflect on.
Well, who does liberalism serve right now? Who are the primary people who are being served by liberalism in this country? I think when we think about the main crises of this country right now, housing, climate change. What are we doing on those fronts that sort of makes people assured that liberals have their best interests at heart? I mean, the economic inequity across the West in general, but also in Canada, has grown so. I mean, it's like so heavily, just so recently, that it's very fair for someone to say, I don't know why I would feel like that party serves my interests. I don't know why the institutions serve my interests, because they simply don't. And I think the pandemic has sort of changed our relationship a little bit to those governments, because I don't know, I think before the pandemic, there was a period of time where you could say to people, hey, we can't do this because of the debt. We can't do this because it'll cost too much. But we've seen... I think we have seen governments move at a pace so extraordinary at the very start of the pandemic to shore up the economy, to make sure that people are okay, that I think there's a good section of the population that's going to remember this period of time and say, wait a minute, you could do something about all these problems the whole time and you weren't doing it. And maybe the real problem is that liberalism has fallen deeply into a managerial rut. This idea of just a steady hand would keep everything going, and we're going to make incremental improvements and changes to people's lives during a time where people's lives are getting worse and they need bigger, more inventive help. You hear liberals sort of talking about incrementally increasing taxes, and then you hear people like Thomas Piketty who are talking about a minimum inheritance for people of $100,000. There are much larger, more inventive ideas for how to solve these problems than the liberalism seems to be willing to offer at the moment, and that would of course appear like a sinking ship, or at least not the most exciting ship to jump aboard. At least the other one is offering an opportunity to blow it all up and say, I don't know what else we could do, but let's try something else because this isn't working.
Awesome. Elamin, this conversation's been absolutely fantastic, but as it turns out, time flies when you're having a conversation like this. So I have to wrap it up, but I would love to continue this, man. I've really loved talking with you.
Thank you for having me, man. It's been a pleasure. We could do a whole pod on Elton John. I mean, I'm not sure who would listen, but
you know what? I've got a couple friends, and let's do it because I would enjoy just doing it for myself. I would watch the recording myself. Anyway, and any friend of Brandi Carlile is a friend of mine. Fuck, that woman is tremendous. Oh my God, incredible. So moving. And I thought you gave the High Women a little short shrift in the article you wrote about her for BuzzFeed, because the High Women are awesome.
I know. I'm going to see them. I'm going to see them in August. I'm going to see them in July in Chicago, and it's going to be a great time.
Yeah,
I'm really excited about that. But I got to tell you, I've been assembling this Elton John covers bracket. Just like a sort of best 16 Elton John covers. I'll run it past you. You'll see.
Covers of him or covers by him? Covers
of him. Where are the best covers of Elton John? And
all right.
The whole idea is it's going to be a bracket, like a March Madness kind of thing, and then they'll compete against each other. And the only thing I'll reveal now is that, regrettably, Nickelback's cover of Saturday Nights We're Fighting is dead last in my seating. So
thank Christ, I couldn't listen to that thing more than once. My God. You know what? No roll, only rock, no roll. Yeah.
Agreed.
Elamin, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank all of you Herle Burlyites for listening to this show, and a special thank you to Elamin and Son of Elsewhere. Pick it up. You'll have a great time reading it, and you'll have a much better understanding of the full Canadian experience after you've read it. See you next week.
Herle Burly.